Today I'd like to present to you a tool that we have developed to not only enable live peer assessment, but which can also generate an automated instant feedback to the presenting students. I'll be presenting how it works, giving an account of its preliminary application in a chemistry laboratory, some future direction, and in line with the theme of this session, grab some potential feedback from you when we engage in a discussion session at the end of this talk. So as I'm sure you'll agree, peer assessments are an invaluable form of teaching. By having students assessing their peers, students may observe alternative perspectives, tactics, and/or strategies to solving a problem. Students also tend to be more accepting of their grades, as there's a shift from personal judgment to an acceptance of grades. And this is due to a variety of factors. One is that there's a unanimous agreement of grades, like in a democracy. Another one is that students are able to directly compare their performance against their peers and understand where their marks were lost. And also we found that students tend to be more accepting of their peers' critiques than their teachers or tutors. However, one of the downsides of peer assessment is that it's often time-consuming to collect grades and feedback. These results are often not readily available, and so there is often a period of time between when a student completes their assessment and when they receive their feedback. And whilst there are various tools and websites now available to help capture peer feedback, we used to use Socrative, for example, that we found that a demonstrator would still need to import these results into a learning management system and/or calculate a final score. So the results were still not readily available. And this gap in time between assessment and feedback is critical. Studies have shown that instant feedback and assessments saw an improved retention of knowledge and correction of strategies. To enable this live peer assessment with instant feedback, we use a student management system called SRES, or Student Relationship Engagement System. I believe it is already being used in many tertiary institutions around Australia, but if it's not at your institute and you'd like to use it, I believe it is free to all educational institutions by visiting SRES.io. So the best way to explain SRES is that it's like a highly functioning spreadsheet. Your students are listed in rows and your data is stored in columns. But what's extraordinary about SRES is that there are multiple sources of input which can be entered in by either teachers, teaching assistants, admins, or even the students themselves. And this can be done using a computer, a mobile phone or tablet. You could import using a spreadsheet, or even link it with your learning management system and synchronize the data from that. So the data is stored into a table, and just like a spreadsheet, you can manipulate it using equations and formulas. However, it is the output of the data that is crucial in how we personalize our interaction with our students, as well as influences our pedagogical decisions. And we can specifically interact with a finite group of students based on filtered data. And we can do this through a variety of means. So we can have customized messages or emails that are sent to a subset set of students, depending on certain information. We can have personalized web pages generated for specific students with specific information. And we can also have the system automatically mine the data to identify at-risk students using learning analytics. But it's the ability of students to be able to enter data into the system, combined with these web portals, which will be the highlight of my talk today. So first, a little bit of background on the class activity that I ran the peer assessment exercise on. In this particular experiment, students studied various surfactants to identify the concentration at which surfactants started forming these micelles, using conductivity meters. They work in groups of 3 and present their findings in 5-slide oral presentation, which is assessed and graded by an academic, a demonstrator, and their peers. Marking is done live from a laptop, tablet, or mobile phone during the oral presentation. SRES generates a user-friendly form, such as this here, that will allow people to enter data into a spreadsheet. The academic and demonstrator complete a detailed marking rubric for the oral presentation. Academics simply click on the descriptors that they believe best satisfies each criterion. So just like marking a rubric, however, you'll notice that the numeric values are purposely not displayed, and that's to remove subjectivity and to promote consistent marks across a cohort. However, in the background, SRES is saving a numeric value, which contributes to the total final mark of each presenter. As well as this, there is a feedback statement which is also behind each tile, which can also be shared with the students. But I'll tell you a bit more about this later on. So students are presented with this rather simple looking 3 criteria marking rubric. that focuses more around the data presentation. We kept it simple so that students were not overwhelmed with items to scrutinise. Plus, it fits nicely on a mobile phone screen, which many students elected to use in the lab. Students simply click on these descriptors that they believe satisfy each criterion. And again, numeric values are absent from the screen, but stored in the background and calculated. I'd also like to mention that although our form had only radio buttons, SRES is capable of collecting data through a range of data entry types, such as sliders, drop-downs, free text, and even hand-drawn. Now, whenever I mention students contributing to the marks of their peers, people are always concerned about how students might exploit the system to alter their marks. So whether it might be to score themselves or friends higher marks, or to mark everyone down to make them on top of their class, SRES has a number of control options to deter academic misconduct. Firstly, whilst the peer scores are not disclosed to the students, academics can see the scores posted by each student. So if you do find a student is consistently scoring everyone zeros, an academic might want to ask the student to validate their scoring. Secondly, students can only grade their peers within their same class. So they won't be able to score themselves, and they won't be able to grade their friends or even their enemies on another day or lab group. They'll be restricted to only marking the 8 to 12 students presented in their group on their particular day. We've also enforced time restrictions, so data entry can only occur during lab hours or assessment times. So trying to access this rubric outside these hours will only result in the access denied page. Another control measure is that only the last entry per student is counted. You can also elect for only the first entry. This is so a student can't manipulate a peer score by trying to flood the system with a bunch of scoring. And lastly, we take the average score from the class. So any outlier scoring by a student will just be diluted down by the majority of the class. The other component of peer assessment is that we give students additional marks if they ask presenters an engaging question. But unlike the group presentation, this mark is not distributed to the other group members. And so it's a chance for a student to break away from their group's result with an individual contribution. This is scored by the demonstrator chairing the session and captured by SRES. So I present to you the data table that is working in the background of SRES. As I said earlier, it looks a little bit like a spreadsheet with its rows and its columns. But don't get lost in all the data. I just want to show you here how oral presentation scores are calculated. So here you have the academic and demonstrator scores, or the raw data. These are combined to give you a total academic mark. The student data entries are all saved in this column here, and then averaged in the column here. You then get the totals of these two columns and combine in any bonus marks for questions asked to calculate a final grade, which is calculated instantly and presented to the presenters. So to present the results to the students, SRES generates an iframe code, which is simply a HTML page which can be seamlessly embedded within another HTML page, such as a page in your learning management system. In our case, it's Canvas. So using an iframe, we can display live information directly from our SRES table. So this means as soon as all the assessors click save, the assessment results will be available to the presenters. So essentially, as the presenters will have their feedback by the time it takes them to walk down from the podium, or maybe in current times, maybe by the time it takes them to figure out how to unshare their screen in Zoom. So you can see here that SRES has calculated their total score based on the academic, demonstrator scores, average peer mark, and any question bonus marks they've gotten. Academics also have the option of adding a free text feedback, which you can see appears here. We could have done this also for students, but I'm a little bit dubious on the quality of the feedback in such a confined time frame. Plus, it will always be hard to censor student-generated comments in a live result posting environment. However, there is a workaround. You can see up a little bit higher, we have another feedback statement. This is for a lab sample, but this phrase was constructed automatically in SRES. So SRES is capable of piecing together a string of feedback statements based on a student's score in each criterion. So on the data entry page, assessors would simply click on these descriptor tiles and that they think best matches each criterion. And if you remember earlier, I mentioned that SRES stores these in the background as numbers. So the data looks a bit like this. But in addition to these grades, you can also save feedback statements to each score for each criterion. So depending on the number here, you're able to store, look up a feedback statement that has been assigned to each score for each criterion. So what that means is that if a student scores 0 for criterion 1, SRES will output the feedback that you wrote for that particular score, for that particular criterion. If a student scores 1 for criterion 1, they'll get a different feedback based on what you wrote. And so SRES puts together a feedback from criteria 1 with the feedback from criteria 2, 3, and 4. And so you do this to create a long descriptive feedback for each student. It's based on their performance in each criterion. So for example, the feedback for student A will be different to the feedback that student B will get, provided they get different scores in the different criterions. And this is all done automatically and instantly. As soon as the assessors click save, the students will be able to see their mark and hence have a nice descriptive feedback to reflect on. So this is a feature we're hoping to incorporate into future peer assessment activities. So in addition to having numeric grades, we hope to provide constructive and eloquently written feedback, depending on the grades scored by both teachers and students. So what do students think of this system? So 72% of students enjoyed the process and having their marks decided upon by their peers. For the 7% that did not like it, their main concern voiced was that they think peers would just mark full marks, and so they saw the exercise as pointless. And whilst there's no surprise that the majority of students ask a question when points are involved, it does mean that 74% of students had engaged with at least one other group's presentation to be capable of asking a relevant question. And as I mentioned at the start, peer assessment can be time-consuming, but we're happy to report that academics and demonstrators both said that SRES saved time and were easy to use in a live class environment. But possibly the biggest win I believe to this system is that instant feedback was empowered students to be able to immediately discuss their performance with their teacher. And that's good, so they can discuss it whilst their presentation is still fresh in both the teacher and student's mind. This will allow the student to better link the feedback to their performance, and the process of changing their behaviours and strategies for the next assessment begins. And so if you'd like to know more about what I presented today, please feel free to reach out to me. Otherwise, if you'd like to know more about SRES, visit this webpage here, sres.iou, and thank you for your time.